What if the person who's supposed to help you ends up being the one to arrest you? Deja Harris never imagined the nightmare she would face when she walked into that house to save a life. But as her hands were twisted behind her back, handcuffed by the very officer she trusted, she realized some battles weren't fought in the hospital. They were fought in the streets. It was supposed to be a routine emergency. At least, that's what Deja Harris thought as she sped down the highway with her sirens blaring. Her mind was focused on the patient in the back of her ambulance, an elderly woman struggling to breathe. Deja, a black EMT, had seen it all in her 6 years on the job. Heart attacks, car accidents, overdoses. But today was different. Today, the stakes were higher. As Deja maneuvered through the streets of a suburban neighborhood, she could feel the weight of the patient's condition. The woman's pulse was erratic, and with every second that ticked by, her chances of survival were slipping away. Deja's thoughts were only on her patient as she pulled into the driveway of a modest home, the flashing lights from the ambulance lighting up the street. She quickly jumped out of the vehicle, grabbing her medical bag, and headed toward the front door where a frantic woman was waiting. The woman, clearly in distress, pointed to her husband, who was pacing frantically, a look of fear in his eyes. "She's in the back. Please help her. We don't have much time." Deja nodded, her mind focused. She rushed inside, following the woman down a narrow hallway to the bedroom where the elderly woman lay, gasping for air. Deja immediately assessed the situation. She set up the oxygen mask and checked the vitals, working quickly and efficiently as she had been trained. But the tension in the room wasn't just coming from the woman's failing health. Deja could feel eyes on her, sharp, scrutinizing eyes that made her stomach tighten. As she administered the necessary treatments, she heard the door slam open. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" Deja turned to see a police officer standing in the doorway. His uniform was pristine, his posture rigid, and his face twisted in suspicion. "I'm here to help," Deja said, trying to keep her voice calm as she continued her work. "This woman is in critical condition. She needs immediate medical attention." The officer didn't seem to care about her credentials. He stepped further into the room, his eyes narrowing at her. "Are you the one who's been called here?" he barked. Deja stood tall, trying to ignore the growing tension in the room. "Yes, I'm the EMT. I'm working on stabilizing her. Now, if you don't mind." "I do mind." The officer cut her off, his voice rising with authority. "I don't know you, and I don't know what you're doing in here. I've got a job to do. I need you to step away from her now." Deja's heart raced. She had been in situations before where her authority was challenged, but this was different. She could feel the officer's disdain radiating off him, his body language rigid and aggressive. The elderly woman gasped again, her face turning pale. Deja's hands were steady, but inside, a fire was building. How dare this officer tell her what to do when someone's life was on the line? "I'm not leaving," Deja said firmly, her eyes locking with the officer's. "This woman is dying, and I'm the only one here who can help her. You need to step aside." The officer stepped forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "I said step away." He reached for his handcuffs, and before Deja could react, he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. Deja's breath hitched in her throat as she was forced to the floor, her hands cuffed behind her back. The weight of the officer's hands on her was suffocating, but it wasn't the physical restraint that cut the deepest. It was the humiliation. She had spent years training to save lives, and now she was being treated like a criminal in the middle of an emergency. "Officer," Deja shouted, struggling against the handcuffs. "You need to let me go. I'm trying to save her life." The officer ignored her pleas, his grip tightening as he dragged her toward the door. "I'll let you go when I'm sure everything checks out," he said coldly. At that moment, a voice came from behind him, one that Deja recognized immediately. "Stop." The officer turned around to see a woman standing in the doorway of the bedroom, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. She was wearing a hospital gown, looking disheveled but determined. Her eyes widened as she saw her husband, standing in the corner of the room, holding the handcuffs, his face red with anger. "Stop. What is going on here?" the woman demanded. The officer blinked in confusion. "This woman is being detained for questioning." I don't care what she's being detained for. The woman interrupted, her voice rising. That's my husband you're manhandling, and you're making a huge mistake. The officer faltered, unsure of what was happening. He glanced at the woman, then back at Deja, who was still struggling to stand. I was the one who called for help, the woman continued, her voice trembling. I'm his wife, and this woman, she pointed at Deja, was saving my life just now. I was the one who collapsed in there. The officer's eyes widened in shock as the truth hit him. The woman wasn't just some bystander, she was the patient, and Deja was the one trying to save her life. He looked back at the scene, his brain processing the situation far too late. I'm so sorry, the officer muttered, lowering his handcuffs. I didn't realize. The damage had already been done. Deja stood up, shaking with rage and disbelief. You didn't realize? You didn't realize you were handcuffing the one person who was saving her life. The woman, her voice still filled with shock, walked over to Deja and placed a hand on her arm. You saved my life, and I'll never forget it. Don't let him get away with this. The officer's face was full of guilt, but that didn't change the fact that Deja had been wrongfully detained. And in the midst of all the chaos, the woman's words echoed in her mind. Don't let him get away with this. But as the officer tried to apologize, Deja noticed something strange in the woman's eyes. A flicker of something she couldn't place. The woman looked past her, at the officer, and then quickly averted her gaze. Deja's heart skipped a beat. There was something more to this story, something the officer and the woman weren't telling her. Before she could ask, the sound of police sirens grew louder outside. Deja's pulse quickened. Was there more danger waiting outside? Or was this just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy that was tied to the officer's actions? I don't trust him, Deja muttered under her breath, her instincts screaming at her. And as the sirens neared, she realized that this was far from over. The weight of the officer's apology hung in the air like a lead balloon, but Deja didn't let it sink in. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. She had been handcuffed, detained, humiliated, and for what? For saving a life. For doing her job. The officer's face was now a mixture of guilt and disbelief, but Deja could barely register it. Her eyes were fixed on the woman standing in front of her, the one she had just saved, who had now become a part of something far bigger than just a routine medical emergency. I'm so sorry, the officer muttered again, taking a step back. His voice shook, but it was too little, too late. Deja stood tall, rubbing her wrists, still feeling the sting of the handcuffs. You're sorry? That doesn't undo what you've just done. That doesn't change what almost happened. The woman, the one Deja had revived, looked at the officer with a mixture of anger and sympathy. She stepped toward Deja, her gaze softening as she placed a hand on her arm. I know you didn't deserve this. Thank you for saving me. Her voice was low, almost trembling with emotion. But I think you need to know what just happened. It's not over. There's more to the story. Deja's eyes narrowed, and her pulse quickened. What do you mean? The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering over to the officer, who was still standing awkwardly by the door. There's more going on here. This wasn't just some random mistake. Before Deja could press her further, the sound of distant sirens grew louder, growing in volume. Deja turned to the officer, who had gone quiet, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. She felt an unsettling sense of déjà vu, as though this moment had already been set in motion before she'd even entered the room. Why are the sirens getting closer? Deja demanded, her voice edged with suspicion. The officer didn't answer, and in that silence, Deja's instincts screamed at her to move. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a case of police overreach or ignorance. It was something far deeper. The woman, who had been silent up until now, looked at Deja again. Her expression was no longer one of fear, but of something else, something that struck Deja as dangerously close to guilt. The police aren't just here because of you, the woman said softly, glancing nervously at the officer. They've been watching us. Deja's blood ran cold. Us? The woman nodded, swallowing hard. It's not just about a woman in distress. You weren't just responding to an emergency. You were responding to a setup. Deja took a step back, disbelief clouding her mind. A setup? What do you mean? The woman's gaze shifted to the officer, who looked away, clearly uncomfortable. My name is Erica, by the way. Erica Bell. I'm married to Officer Luke Bell, the man who just arrested you for trying to save my life. Deja's heart skipped a beat. Your husband. Erica nodded slowly. But that's not the worst of it. My husband is part of something very dangerous. Something I didn't even realize until it was too late. He's connected to a strong group. One that's been pushing black people out of this community for years. They've been using the police to intimidate, harass, and remove families from their homes. Your arrest? It was part of a bigger plan. Deja felt like the floor had dropped out beneath her. Her mind reeled with the implications. She had suspected corruption. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The officers, the ones who harassed you, they're connected. The arrests, the forced evictions, it's all about money. The developers who've been gentrifying this neighborhood, they're funding the police to clear the area. And they've been using people like Luke to drive black families out, one by one. Deja's pulse raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She had been fighting a medical battle, but this wasn't just about saving lives. It was about saving her community. Luke, Deja asked, your husband, the officer, is he involved in the scheme? What does he know? Erica's eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't look away. I didn't know. I didn't understand until recently. He's been hiding it from me for months. But I've seen things, heard things that can't be ignored. The officer, Luke Bell, who had been standing silently in the corner, shifted uncomfortably. He finally spoke, his voice tight. Erica, stop. You don't know what you're talking about. But Erica shook her head. No, Luke. I do. I've seen the money you've been taking, the meetings you've been going to, the promises they've made to you. You're involved in this, and it has to stop. Deja was still processing the shocking revelations when the door to the house suddenly burst open, and a group of armed police officers stormed into the room. They were all in full gear, their weapons drawn, and the room instantly became a battlefield of confusion and chaos. I told you to stop, Luke snapped, but his voice was shaky now. We have to leave, Erica. It's not safe. I'm not going anywhere with you. Erica shot back, her voice filled with defiance. Not anymore. Deja's hands balled into fists. Her training as an EMT hadn't prepared her for this, but she was no stranger to danger. She couldn't afford to stand still, not when so much was at stake. She turned to Erica. We need to go. Now. I'll help you. But before they could move, one of the officers lunged at Deja, grabbing her by the arm and twisting it behind her back. She struggled, but her training kept her grounded. Let me go, she shouted. This is about more than just a routine arrest now, EMT. The officer sneered. We know who you are, and you'll pay for getting in our way. The room erupted in chaos as the sound of police radios crackled, and the tension between the officers reached a boiling point. But as Deja's breath quickened and Erica's eyes darted nervously around the room, she realized that the danger had escalated. The truth was out, but the battle was far from over. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and an unmarked car pulled up in front of the house. Deja's instincts screamed that this wasn't just about her. This was about the future of every black family in the neighborhood. But as Erica's voice shook with fear, and Luke stepped forward with a dark look in his eyes, Deja knew one thing for certain. They were up against something far bigger than they ever imagined. And the fight for justice had just begun. The situation in the house escalated rapidly. The officers, armed and ready for a confrontation, closed in around Deja and Erica. The weight of the guns pointed toward them was almost suffocating. The house felt smaller by the second, and the air was thick with impending danger. Every muscle in Deja's body screamed to move, to fight back, but she knew she had to stay calm. There was too much at stake. I told you, the officer who had been holding Deja's arm sneered. This is bigger than you think. Deja's eyes burned with fury. This wasn't just about saving lives anymore. This was about survival. And what she didn't know was that her involvement had already made her a target in a much larger, more dangerous game than she had ever imagined. Erica stepped in front of Deja, her voice shaking but full of determination. "You can't do this. This isn't just about some routine arrest. This is about corruption, about a network that has been using the police to intimidate, harass, and destroy the lives of black families in this neighborhood." The officer scoffed, stepping closer to Erica. "And you're going to stop it, how? With your words? Your activism?" His voice dripped with derision. "This is how the world works. People like you don't get to decide who stays and who goes." Deja's pulse raced. "That's not true," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We decide. We fight. And we're not backing down." But the officer wasn't listening. His attention shifted back to the unmarked car parked outside. Deja felt the weight of his glare on her once more, and in that moment, she realized that what she had seen in the officer's eyes wasn't just anger, it was fear. Fear that something much bigger was coming for them, and they weren't ready. "Get her in the car," the officer barked. Without warning, two other officers moved to grab Deja. Her mind raced as she fought back, using her strength to resist the rough hands pulling her away. But there was something in the officer's voice, a subtle shift, that made her stop. Before they could move her, a loud crash from outside shook the house. It was the sound of a door being kicked open, followed by shouting. The officers stopped dead in their tracks, their heads snapping toward the sound. Then the door to the living room burst open. Danielle Graves, Deja's lawyer, the civil rights attorney who had been fighting behind the scenes, stormed into the room, her eyes blazing with fury. She was flanked by two federal agents, both in tactical gear, and they had the look of people who had come to take action, not to negotiate. "Let her go," Danielle commanded, her voice powerful and unwavering. "You are making a mistake." The officers froze. Danielle's presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Her reputation had preceded her, and now, with federal agents at her back, the stakes had just been raised to a level none of the officers were prepared for. The officer holding Deja's arm hesitated, his grip loosening. The tension was palpable, but it didn't break. Deja stood there, handcuffed, but now something had shifted in the balance of power. Danielle moved forward, standing tall and unyielding. "You need to release her now," Danielle repeated, her voice like ice. "And you need to listen carefully. This is no longer a local matter. The feds are involved, and we've been tracking your actions. You think you can hide behind the badge, but you won't. Not anymore." For a moment, the officer who had been holding Deja's arm faltered, then finally dropped his gaze, unwilling to meet Danielle's eyes. "I don't know what you think you know," the officer muttered, his voice shaky. "But I'm just following orders." "And who's giving those orders?" Danielle shot back, taking a step closer. "Your higher-ups. The developers who have been buying up this neighborhood, clearing out black families, and using you to do their dirty work. This is over. The evidence is clear. You've been part of a scheme to destroy lives and profit off people's suffering. We have it all documented." The officer's face drained of color as the weight of Danielle's words sank in. "You can't prove that," he whispered, but the doubt in his voice was evident. Danielle smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I don't need to prove it to you. I'm here for something much bigger than you." Before the officer could respond, Erica spoke up, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "How long did you think you could keep this going, Luke? How long did you think you could hide the truth from me? From all of us? You've been lying to me, to your own wife. And for what? Money? Power?" The officer, Luke, looked at his wife, his face a mixture of guilt and shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Stop it," Erica continued, her voice breaking. "Just stop. I won't be a part of this anymore. I won't let you ruin more lives. You need to tell the truth. Tell them everything." Luke's eyes darted to the federal agents, who stood silently by Danielle's side, ready for action. His expression shifted from one of defiance to one of complete surrender. He finally dropped his head in defeat. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "But I was just doing what I was told. I didn't think it would hurt people. I thought it was just business." Danielle stepped forward. "It's not business. It's corruption, and it ends now." But as the tension in the room started to dissipate, the door suddenly slammed open again. A man, tall and lean, stepped into the room. He was wearing a suit, but it was clear he wasn't a part of the regular police force. His face was familiar to Danielle and to Ike. It was Kenneth West, one of the developers who had been funding the entire operation. "I'm afraid you're too late, Miss Graves," Kenneth said, his voice smooth, but with a dangerous edge. "The truth doesn't matter anymore. You've already made your mistake." Danielle's expression didn't change. "This isn't over, Kenneth. You're about to lose everything." Kenneth smirked, and just as he opened his mouth to respond, the room was filled with the sound of sirens and the unmistakable hum of helicopters overhead. The door to the living room slammed shut, and the sound of boots hitting the floor echoed from behind it. The cavalry had arrived, but it wasn't the cavalry they had expected. The door was about to burst open again, but this time, the stakes were higher than ever, and Deja could feel it. The world around them was about to change. The real battle was just beginning. The tension in the room was unbearable. Luke Bell, the officer who had detained Deja just minutes ago, stood frozen, his face a mask of shame and regret. The atmosphere had shifted from one of authority and intimidation to one of uncertainty. But as the sound of approaching sirens and helicopters grew louder, the reality of their situation hit Deja like a wave. This was far from over. Kenneth West, the developer who had masterminded the scheme to displace black families from their homes, stood at the door, his posture casual, almost smug. His confidence seemed to come from the fact that he thought he was untouchable. But today, that sense of invincibility was about to come crashing down. "I'm afraid you're too late, Miss Graves," Kenneth said, his voice smooth but dripping with arrogance. "The truth doesn't matter anymore. You've already made your mistake." Deja clenched her fists, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The truth had always mattered. It was why she had been fighting for years, fighting to save lives, fighting to bring justice where it had been denied. But Kenneth wasn't done. He hadn't expected this battle, and Deja wasn't about to let him win now. Danielle, standing beside her, did not flinch. Her voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "This isn't over, Kenneth. You're about to lose everything. We've got the evidence, and it's more than enough to take you down." Kenneth scoffed, stepping further into the room. The door to the living room slammed shut behind him, and the sound of boots echoed from the hallway. It was clear that this wasn't just a confrontation. It was about to turn into something much darker. Deja could feel it. The world they had been trying to protect was slipping away. "Evidence," Kenneth said, his eyes flashing with anger. "Do you think I'm afraid of your so-called evidence? You think I'm the only one involved? You have no idea what you're up against." The air in the room grew heavy as the sirens continued to blare in the distance. Deja could hear the hum of helicopters overhead. She could feel the ground beneath her shift. The time for words was over. She had to act. Suddenly, a noise from outside caught her attention, a loud metallic bang. The front door of the house was kicked open with force, and the room was filled with a swarm of police officers. But these weren't the officers who had been in the house earlier. These were armed, tactical units, SWAT officers, their faces covered by masks, their weapons drawn. Deja's heart pounded. This is it. It's all happening now. The officers, under the command of someone she didn't recognize, stormed into the room. Danielle stepped forward, her voice steady but commanding. "Stop. You don't have the authority to arrest anyone here. This is a federal matter. Back off." But the lead officer, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes, didn't budge. "Step aside, Miss Graves. We've been instructed to take everyone into custody. Now, including you." "By who?" Danielle asked sharply. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for the other officers to move in. Deja felt the tension spike in the room. There were more than just a handful of officers now. There were at least a dozen, each one more menacing than the last. The weapons were a reminder that this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for survival. As the officers moved closer, Deja felt a presence at her side. She turned to see Erica, the woman whose life she had just saved, standing beside her. Her hands were trembling, but there was a fire in her eyes that Deja hadn't seen before. "We're not going anywhere," Erica said, her voice fierce. "We know what's happening here. You can't just arrest us. We have the truth. The world is watching. Danielle nodded, her jaw clenched. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. You're about to go down for the corruption that's been running through this city. This is bigger than all of you. Kenneth, standing in the back of the room, seethed with rage. You think you can take me down? You think you can tear down everything I've built? Deja stepped forward, her voice rising. It's not what you built, Kenneth. It's what you destroyed. What you stole from families who had nothing but their homes and their communities. But as the officers moved in, it wasn't just the weight of their presence that hit her. It was the realization that this wasn't going to be a clean victory. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for their lives. Just as the officers reached out to grab Erica and Deja, the sound of the front door slamming open again rang through the house. This time, it wasn't another batch of officers or SWAT members. It was a group of protesters, their fists raised high, their voices shouting in unison. We won't back down, they chanted. Justice for Deja. Justice for black families. Deja's heart surged. The crowd was large, and the energy they brought with them was overwhelming. Their presence was like a spark in a powder keg, one that ignited the hope Deja had been fighting for. The tide was shifting. She could feel it. But just as the protesters began to flood the room, Kenneth's smirk returned. You think this changes anything? You think you can just march in here and make a difference? You're already too late. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. The lights flickered, and the door to the living room swung open once more. This time, it wasn't the officers, nor was it anyone from the protesters. It was a figure dressed in a sharp suit, his face partially hidden by the shadows. Enough, the man said, his voice deep and commanding. We're done playing games. Everyone in the room froze. It wasn't the man's voice that made everyone stop. It was the recognition in Danielle's eyes, the shift in her expression. The man stepped into the light, and Deja's heart stopped when she saw who it was. It was Marcus Rayfield, the city's top attorney, the man who had been behind the scenes, orchestrating everything that had gone wrong, the one who had been funding the developers, working with corrupt officers, and turning the city into his personal empire. Danielle's face drained of color. You, she whispered. Marcus's eyes glinted with something dark and powerful. It's too late for you to turn back now, Ms. Graves. I've controlled this city for years, and you won't take it from me. Deja's pulse quickened as Marcus's words sank in. This wasn't just about the police anymore. This was a battle against a man who had been pulling strings in the city for years, someone who had orchestrated the entire network of corruption from the shadows. But just as the room began to close in on her, Deja felt the ground shift beneath her. There was no turning back now. The truth was out, but what was about to come next would change everything. As Marcus raised his hand, signaling his next move, Deja's eyes locked with Danielle's, and they both understood. The real battle was just beginning. The air in the room was thick with tension, every breath I took feeling heavier than the last. Marcus Rayfield's presence loomed like a shadow over everyone in the room, but it wasn't just his power or his wealth that made his presence terrifying. It was his sheer control over the system. The man had been pulling the strings for years, weaving a web of corruption that had ruined lives, displaced families, and terrorized a community. And now Deja, Danielle, and Erica were standing in front of him, knowing full well that the fate of everything they had fought for hung in the balance. But there was one thing Marcus Rayfield hadn't counted on, the power of truth. Danielle Graves took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Marcus's. She had been fighting this battle for years, and the realization hit her like a flood. This was no longer about her career, her reputation, or even her own life. This was about justice. It was about fighting for the lives that had been stolen, the families that had been broken, and the countless black people who had been oppressed and left voiceless. You've underestimated us, Danielle said, her voice cold but filled with conviction. And you've underestimated the people of this city. You might have thought you could control everything, but you've made one mistake, thinking that the truth wouldn't come for you. Marcus's lips curled into a smirk, but it was tight strained. And what are you going to do about it, Miss Graves? The system's on my side. I'm untouchable. But as the words left his mouth, something shifted in the room. The doors to the living room, which had been eerily quiet moments ago, slammed open, and a group of federal agents flooded the room. Their presence was like a wave crashing down, and Marcus's smirk faltered as his eyes scanned the new faces. The agents weren't just there for show. They had come prepared, with full authority, ready to dismantle the empire Marcus had built. Danielle's voice cut through the noise. "We've been tracking your every move, Marcus. You can't hide behind money and power anymore. This is over." The agents moved in swiftly, surrounding Marcus. He didn't resist. He didn't fight back. The shock on his face was evident, but it wasn't just disbelief. It was fear. Fear that, for the first time, the system he had manipulated was turning against him. "I should have known," Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. "You think the law will save you? You think your so-called justice is enough to break me?" "It's not just about the law," Deja interjected, her voice steady as she stepped forward. "It's about people. It's about families. It's about lives that you've tried to destroy for your own gain. This isn't just about you, Marcus. It's about all the people you've tried to crush." Marcus stood there, surrounded by agents, his mouth moving, but no words came out. He knew it was over. There was no escape now. The truth had caught up with him, and for the first time, he was powerless. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, Deja's heart began to slow. The room, which had been filled with chaos just moments before, began to calm. The fight was far from over. There were still systems to reform, still justice to be fully realized. But for the first time in years, there was a sense of peace in the air. Erica, who had been standing quietly by the side, her hands still trembling, let out a long, shaky breath. I can't believe it," she whispered, looking over at Deja. "You saved my life. And now we've saved so many others. But I never thought it would come to this." Deja smiled softly, her eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. "We didn't save just one life, Erica. We saved a community." Danielle stood nearby, her gaze shifting between the people in the room. "This is just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do. But we've made it clear that no one is above the law. Not him. Not anyone." And as the federal agents continued their work, dismantling the corruption piece by piece, Deja couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The weight that had been on her shoulders for so long had finally begun to lift. The system, which had tried to break her, had failed. The truth had won. The victory was sweet, but it was still a bitter reminder of a long battle ahead. The truth may have been revealed today, but the work was far from finished. Families would still need protection. The system would still need to be held accountable. But at least now, Deja knew they had the power to make it happen. The news cameras flashed as the agents led Marcus Rayfield out of the house. But for Deja, this moment wasn't about the spotlight. It was about the people. It was about every family who had been pushed out, every voice that had been silenced, and every life that had been destroyed. They had all fought to be heard, and today, they had won. As she walked outside with Erica and Danielle, Deja looked out at the crowd of protesters who had gathered on the street. They weren't there just for her. They were there for the truth. They were there for justice. They were there for each other. "This victory isn't just ours," Deja said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It's for every single person who has been wronged, for every black family who has been pushed aside, for every soul who has been silenced." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers ringing out through the streets. Deja felt a swell of pride and gratitude wash over her. This wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for the people, a win for justice, a win for every single person who had fought for what was right. But as she stood there, looking at the faces of those who had supported her, Deja knew that this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done. There were still battles to fight. But with every step they took, they would bring change. They would bring justice. If you've been inspired by Deja's story and want to see more stories about real change, real justice, and real struggles, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this message with others so we can continue to fight together. Let us know in the comments. What would you do if you were in Deja's shoes? How can we make our community stronger? The fight doesn't end here. Let's keep pushing for justice, one story at a time.